Good evening. I would like to call to order the Board of Library Trustees Committee of the Whole meeting for this Monday, June 2nd, 2025. May I have a roll call, please?
Trustee Burrell?
Here.
Trustee Bella?
Here.
Trustee Kelly?
Here.
Trustee McLeany?
Here.
Trustee Meadow?
Here.
Trustee Watts?
Here.
President Smart?
Here. Could we all please stand for the pledge of allegiance? I pledge allegiance to the flag
of the United States of America, and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. Do we have any public comment? We do not. All right. I am going to make a motion to reorder our agenda just a tad because our financial audit, our auditor is having some car trouble, so she's going to be a little bit late. So we are going to move item number listed as number 5 to the end of our meeting just before other. So we will start with the budget timetable. May I have a second?
Second.
And all in favor? Okay. So, how about the budget timetable? Hello.
Okay, excuse me. So I included the timetable in your packets, and it's largely the same as it's been the last couple, so nothing major has changed. So the bolded dates are the ones that are most applicable to you, the board, and then the rest are sort of key internal deadlines that we'll use when working with the management team to pull together, all the detailed budget information. So like I said, it's consistent with the last few years. There's really no significant changes or meeting shifts to work around, conferences or things like that to work around. So I'll just highlight a couple of the key dates for you. On the front end, you'll see that the first bolded date is today. So we'll go over the draft of the 2026 targets in just a minute, and then we'll bring them back for approval at the June board meeting. And then on the back end, we're planning to review the first draft of the consolidated 2026 budget at the September COW, and then the final draft of the budget at the October COW, which we'll bring for approval at the October board meeting, which is again our usual timing. And then our budget treasurer will kind of present that at the budget hearing in November for acceptance into the published budget book. So yeah, do you have any questions on the timeline?
Just real quick, for the October 9th, is that just like, we're basically like emailing them the draft? It's not like.
Yes, it's just a key handoff because of them including our budget in the printed published version. There's there's a timeline that they have to stick to in order to get it printed. Doesn't mean we can't change it. It's not approved yet, so you can have change pages and things like that. But to kind of like a really good final draft, just a key handoff date. Yeah.
And you're working with finance with the village throughout.
All throughout. Yes, already been in touch with them. Yes, so they're on top of this.
Great. All right. Thank you very much. All right. How about budget targets?
Okay, so moving on to the budget targets, as well as the long range fiscal plan. So the targets are really just early estimates of where we think key budget components will end up for the 2026 budget year. And we'll reference them throughout the entire budget process as we get more and better information and really hone like 1 year's worth of budget. Will tell you whether or not those are going into these initial targets that are just estimates. So they're developed using various sources, and they're organized on the first page in that way by their source. So the sources from top to bottom include the board, the staff, the village, the government, and the market. And the ones developed internally by the staff, we derive from historical actual information, assumptions about those trends will either continue or maybe we know they're going to change moving forward, and then calculations off of the long range fiscal plan. And those first 5 targets really are derived from the detail in that long range fiscal plan. So I'd like to start there, if that's okay. So you should flip over to that schedule. And there's a couple of you seeing this for the first time. And so the main thing I really want to point out is that this file is really just a planning tool. It shows information about two funds, so we have the general fund and the capital fund. And it's across a number of years, past, present, and future. So the schedule is presented in thousands. And you'll see 2 years of actual results, the first two columns. So for 2023 and 2024, those years are done, they're complete, those are actuals. And then 6 years of estimated data. And so you can think of the 2025 column as an estimate that based on the current year's approved budget with a couple of adjustments, for where we think we're actually gonna end the year. Because of course we budget for being fully staffed for the whole year. It's not realistic. We want to try to make this a little bit more of a realistic viewpoint, even though we're not far enough into the year to have actual projections or anything like that yet. So we make just a couple of adjustments to the approved budget for that column. And then the years 2026 and beyond are estimates based on the assumptions that are noted at the top of the page and in the footnotes at the bottom of the page. So each column kind of starts with the opening fund balances, adds in revenues, subtracts expenditures to arrive at an estimated ending fund balance for each year. And the whole purpose of this view is not to be 100%. In those future years, where of course we don't have those results yet, we do not have a crystal ball to tell us what's going to happen, but it's just a tool where we can try to model out different scenarios and what we think is going to happen with rising expenses. If we think something's going to rise a little bit more, a little bit less, we can kind of plug those percentages and those rates in. Same thing with levy increases or capital projects. Like, what do we think we're looking at here? And we can plug those in and all the numbers will change, kind of compound on themselves over the years in the model and give us a way that we can decide what we want to do now. Well, we still have plenty of time to react in a way that's the most fiscally responsibility for the library and for our taxpayers. So it's just a good dynamic tool to kind of give ourselves the best estimate in the absence of being able to know what's going to happen for sure. So in the middle of the page, at the bottom of the general fund section, there's this highlighted, bolded box line art that those of you who have been on the board for a while are very familiar with. It's a key metric on this file, and that's because here at the library, we have an unrestricted general fund balance requirement policy that says we must keep this fund's balance at no less than 4 months or 33% and no more than 9 months or 75% of the coming year's expected annual operating expenditures. So this line R will tell us if we believe we'll fall within that range over the coming years based on the assumptions that we've sort of landed on it as of at this moment in time. So, with expenditures rising, of course, every year, especially like personnel costs, things like that are big chunks of our budget. Then our main source of revenue, which is property taxes, remaining relatively flat to, of course, we always want to avoid steeply increasing taxes for our residents. You can, kind of easily see that impact coming through that big boxed line in that percentage, because you can see how that ratio of funds to the next year's expenditures, which starts off in that upper end of that range, even over it at times, at which point we'll do a transfer to a capital fund. It sort of ticks down slowly over time. But it's important to remember that that's actually very normal at this point in time, at this look. These are just estimates. So the numbers get less and less each year further out you're looking, because it's, assumptions upon assumptions. So we really don't even look any further than 5 years out for this purpose. Overall, those ratios are pretty typical for what we see at this point in the year. In the planning process, and they do, demonstrate to us a healthy long-range outlook. It's just that, although we still come in favorable on the expense side, as we just saw at the last meeting, we don't in recent years experienced quite enough favorability in these current market conditions where, the favorability alone can kind of pad our fund balance quite enough to where we need to be without also a small levy increase too. Just, we're favorable on the expense side, just not quite favorable enough to not meet both pieces in our recommendation. So then before I move down to that capital section, I just want to take all of that and flip back over to the actual targets to see if that information translates over there. So we're assuming 2% as our initial levy increase target, and it's primarily driven by needs for things like personnel costs and then funding kind of longer term capital projects that we think the library will use. So again, it's just a target at this time, and that's reflected in line 2, the maximum operating budget increase of 4.2%. That can be thought of as the overall sort of blended maximum increase in operating expenditures comprised of all the other targets, below it. So that might not be 100% clear, at first glance from this format, since again, it's organized by the source of the target. But if you flip to that, second page, you can see what's organized it in same exact targets in a slightly different way. So that you can kind of see how they relate to each other, because again, all the targets below number 2 really do feed into that overall 4.2%. I like to see it that way. I'm not sure, maybe some of you like it one way or other, slicing and dicing. I often like to slice and dice the same information in a couple of different ways, to see how it might be useful. So we calculated that 4.2% overall target from the year-over-year change in the expected operating costs that on the long-range fiscal plan. So that's kind of how the one relates to the other, if that makes sense. So some of those component targets, are very large pieces of the pie, like the personnel costs. 72% of our overall operating budget are personnel costs in terms of salaries and benefits. So any increase there has got a huge impact on the overall operating kind of target. Some are very, very small. So, for example, at the bottom, we have a target for our Vera insurance premiums, which is a pool that we're a member of. And that one increases up to 14% based on early estimates. However, Lyra has a history of beating that estimate. Our actual increase will be based on our own risk exposure, and our own loss experience. And it usually comes in much lower than their initial estimate. Plus, if you look at the graphic, our property and casualty liability workers' comp premiums are 1% of our total operating budget. So a 14% increase, even if it went up that much, is not really going to move the needle that much in terms of our overall budget. Would you keep it on the targets for right now? Kind of gives you a good sense of like what's going on in the market overall, but it's really not that impactful. So that's what I have on the targets, like the operating targets. Do you guys have questions on that?
When do you find out from the village what, or maybe it's from the insurance company, what the actual insurance premium increase would be?
For medical insurance, so I actually got an updated number this morning. We have a meeting with them tomorrow, a pre-renewal meeting. My initial estimate on the target was up to 15%, but this morning, good news, they said something they believe a blended increase will be more like 11% for the library. So that's good news already, but we won't get the final, I think it's July, I have to say.
And
Time for budget, and time for finalizing the actual budget, but it won't change the target.
got it. And in terms of for the actual budget, have you had a sense of the village of Arlington has and what they may or may not be doing in terms of a potential levy?
So I've, got to know Melissa Gallagher, who's the new director of finance over at the village, and we're in contact, her and her team. She's indicating the same thing that we're seeing independently in terms of likely needing modest levy increase. So they're still trying to figure out what that is going to be, and I don't want to speak for them because it's so early. And I'm not sure when their meeting is.
Probably not going to be zero.
It's probably not going to be 0. It will probably be at least, what we're looking at as well, possibly for different reasons. But our philosophy is we like to kind of independently come up with what our entities think we need, compare notes throughout as we go. Kind of stay in lockstep in terms of communication, because residents receive one tax bill. It's both of us on the tax bill. So to the extent it makes sense to communicate together, we like to do that. So our first initial touch base seems like we're coming up with this.
And the past couple of years, we have added the loss tax of 2%. Is that indicated to occur again year?
Yes, so on the long range fiscal plan, you can see the loss and cost factor as one of our assumptions at the top of the page. It used to be 1%, they changed it, stating the village who levies our taxes for us. Changed it to 2% a couple of years ago, based on what they were seeing in terms of actual collections. I think this came up at our last meeting, but it's basically a way, it's not a levy increase, it's a factor that you can add on top of the tax levy when you're extending the levy and the tax bills out to residents to try to recoup some uncollected taxes from a previous tax year. Cook County laws to levy, or to not levy, sorry, to add a loss and cost factor up to 5%. You know, of course, we want to be very careful with how much we just add for no reason. So, you know, the village looks very closely at what is uncollectible and just tweaks that loss and costs a little bit based on what they're seeing in terms of actual collection. So that will be 2%.
And then my final question, is what is the number that if we chose to levy higher, what is the number that you can levy, what percentage without seeking a referendum? Is it 5?
It's
5%.
I believe
5?
4.99 is like
Yeah,
the
okay,
maximum
that's what
you
I
could
thought.
do before you trigger.
Got it.
Yeah.
Got it, okay. Those are my questions. Anyone else?
Tracy, can you speak to the insurance pools a little bit and we see big numbers here in increases in liability and medical, but relative to the market and kind of insurance in general, could you maybe speak to how we get our insurance and the pools that we're part of and why it's actually not as bad as it
Yeah, well, like I said, from a property and casualty liability and workers' comp insurance standpoint, that's the one all the way at the bottom. It's only 1%, our premiums are only 1% of our total budget. Very, very small piece of the overall pie. Being part of the pool, Lyra is very helpful in terms of customer service. They keep our premiums very stable. They pay back dividends. There's like a whole actually, there's a handout I can give that to. Anybody who's interested in learning more about Lyra, that's the property casualty liability side. From a medical insurance standpoint, our our staff are considered all part of the same group of staff. Village Valentine staff and library staff are all part of the same kind of insurance with covered individuals and their families. So partnering with the village, having that same brokers that we use, you know, in terms of HR partnership, finance partnership, and then our third party administrators for our medical, dental, all of our benefits. Super helpful. They do a great job for us. Like I said, we're meeting with them tomorrow. We have a seat at the library, has a seat at the table every time in terms of what we want to offer in terms of benefits and keeping those costs down. They go out and negotiate for us to get rates down. They look for credits for us. And it's what allows us, our partnership with the village and our partnership with these third-party companies is really what allows us to have such a robust package that we can offer our staff, which helps hugely in terms of retention and getting the best people work.
And just for the benefit of Barb and Darnell, last year we kind of did a deep dive into health insurance and looked at whether it would be beneficial to offer a monetary incentive for people who don't take our insurance and might either to be with a partner spouse or stay on their parents' insurance. And I think it was super educational for all of us, for you guys especially, and we really feel good about the way that we're doing it now is the best way and the most financially prudent way. But it was a good exercise in understanding what the benefits versus the risks of actually offering some financial incentive for people not to take our insurance. It tends to be healthy people that do that, and then that changes your pool. Yeah, so, okay.
Okay, and then so just really quickly, if I could just pop back over to long range fiscal plan, in terms of capital projects, just want to point out that bottom section relates to our capital fund. So on row AE on this schedule, that represents all of our currently planned capital improvements, and you can see a detailed list of those on the following page in your packet. And we developed this list of projects based on our most recent engineering assessment, which was in August of 2024. And then we don't just kind of take those for what they are. We talk with our facilities team, with administration, with other staff to kind of pull out what we think really needs to happen in the library, kind of when it needs to happen. and then amend this list, you know, continually. So this list that we have in terms of capital projects today for purposes of chart will change as we go through the budget process, and we'll bring it back continually. So be like, actually, we don't think we're gonna do this one, you know, we think we're gonna do this 5 years later. Oh, we talked, you know, maybe we got an estimate, and we can do something different, a different type of solution for the same problem. So, but, you know, should we move forward with any of these projects and put them into our budget for next year? You know, we always follow our procurement policy in terms of going out to bid for anything over a certain dollar amount. For anything a little lower than that, we get through quotes. So just, you know, lots of responsible steps written in our policies that we're always follow, bring them back to board for board approval, you know, when they're over 20,000, to share that information in detail, get your input on, you know, why the library might need it, and why it's a priority over some other projects, so that we can talk about all those things. So yeah, it's this entire page is really just, you know, a first draft, a starting point for future plans, and we'll keep amending it, you know, as we go. That's fine.
Did we budget, I didn't go through every single one of these. Obviously, you know, we knew that we were gonna save for the bookmobile for a couple of years, and we're also asking our foundation and friends to help with that. But just in terms of this 2025, are all those are all in our,
This is
Yes.
exactly to the dollar what
Right.
we have in our
Okay.
2025.
and for EA, obviously engineering assessment, what is thermal imaging? I'm not sure what that means.
Mike?
I can talk about that. That is, it's a camera that we use to look at our large electrical panels, and it changes color on the screen based on the temperature.
Mhm.
So I don't know if
So
you've ever
it's
seen those.
super.
Yeah, so what we look for is hot spots on the panel, and then that would show maybe like a loose connection or something that's starting to fail, and we can adjust accordingly. So we have some older switch gear, the larger panels that we just keep on through that thermal imaging without, because if we went off of the engineering assessment, we would have probably replaced those a few years ago, but we look at every piece of equipment as, does it need to be replaced, or can we get more life out of it? And
Right.
in that case, that's an inexpensive way for us to ensure that it's still, you know,
Right.
a workable piece of equipment, and, you know, we'll hang on to it until, you know, the time comes where we actually have to replace it.
That's smart. Anyone else have any questions? All right, well, thank you. That was really helpful. All right, we have one other item before we're gonna get to you. So, reviewing of issuance of non-resident library cards and fee.
Yes, so every year about this time, the board makes a decision whether or not to offer the non-resident cards, and if so, what to charge for them. So the non-resident cards are for people within our service area that are not tax-paying residents, so unincorporated areas. They have the option to purchase a card called a non-resident card. And this item is to set the fee for that card. There are 3 different ways that you can set a non-resident card fee, which is on the backside of page 1. The general mathematical formula, the tax bill method, and adoption of the average non-resident fee in the system area. That last one doesn't really pertain to us because that is for public service areas with a disproportionately large share of the property valuation in agricultural, industrial, mining, commercial, or other non-residential property. So that really doesn't apply to our area. We go with the general mathematical formula, which basically averages the amount that each household is paying in taxes, and then that's how we set our non-resident library card fee. It's, you know, just kind of an average of everybody's. The other method is the tax bill method, where the non-resident person can bring in their tax bill, and then we would calculate what that fee should be based on what they're paying in taxes. It's a little bit more difficult way to do it because it's really on the customer then to bring that stuff in. It's a little bit more difficult and doesn't really.
Can be looked up,
It can be looked up.
our staff looks it up.
Okay,
Yeah,
okay.
so it can be, but it is an extra step for the
Yeah.
staff, but
Yeah.
if you have, you'd wanna do that if you have a wide variance of housing. If you've got very low, you know, and we do, anywhere from very expensive homes to very inexpensive homes.
Yeah, Gail Borden.
At Gilboa, yeah.
Yeah, so we've gone with the general mathematical formula. We have tried the tax bill method in the past, and we just felt like looking
This
at the
is easier.
variance. Yeah, it is for everybody. And looking at the variance of what the actual cost is, it really doesn't vary much off of the average. So we feel that the general mathematical formula is the one that we should continue with. And then on the last page, this is the worksheet that shows how we come up with that. So it's the population of the community, the income that the library receives from local government sources, the per capita support for our library, which is the basically the per person costs. And then basically with that, we figure the new non-resident fee will be $470 based on those calculations for this year.
Which is actually a decrease.
Yes, down by $7. So,
Hey, couple Snickers bars?
yeah.
So Mike, since you did this calculation, since we did it last year and, as Barb said, it was $477 last year and we approved it. One person buy one?
Correct, yeah, we have one person buy one, and then we also have 3 cards that we do offer cards for kids under the age of 18 in unincorporated areas, the card for free. So we do have 3 people that have renewed those this year, so we do offer those as well, but that is, that's in our policy, kind of separate from this, but we do have the one person that purchased a non-resident card.
Okay.
Is that one more typical? Is that pretty low? We have maybe 1 or 2 per year. Any other questions? Yeah.
Can you remind me, is it just people who live in Arlington Heights but are outside of like the library taxing district, or could someone from like, I don't know, like Chicago, they come out and get a card?
No, they can't. It's only Arlington, it's in our service area. There's actually a rule about where they must be. So in that first bullet point, non-resident library cards must be put at the closest participating public library. So non-residents shall apply at the participating public library in the school district in which a non-resident has his or her principal residence, unless so on and so forth.
Yes.
So it's
actually
It's very small.
small.
Yeah, exactly. Right. Now, people in other communities can get their own library card and then use it here as a reciprocal borrower, which gives them pretty much almost the same rights as a normal HMO card.
And then is there a separate fee for like the ESL service?
No, that's all. If they purchase the non-resident card, they would have access to those services as
Oh,
well.
okay.
Yeah, it would be whatever our regular tax-paying cards. It would be the same for a non-resident card.
We had one person purchase it, but did any other, do multiple people express interest and the cost is just prohibitive, or have you had like
I
more
don't know
people?
that.
So we don't know that, like no one's come in and said,
Yeah.
oh, it's just too much, like.
Yeah, no, we just know that we have the one.
And it's just a couple streets. I mean, it's not
Right,
a large area.
Yeah.
Well, Arlington Heights residents use at least $470 worth of the library.
exactly.
Take out books or things or go to a class.
Well, that's for the whole household.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right. All right, thank you. So you'll bring it to us for approval. That.
Sure.
Wonderful. All right, so we are gonna move back to our financial audit, and we invite Martha Trotter from, pronounce it for me, up to share with us her audit results.
Good evening, thank you. I am Martha Trotter, a principal with Sigich. And I am presenting to you tonight draft of the annual financial report and the draft of the board communication. The audit is largely complete, still in process, waiting on just a few documentation pieces before we issue the final reports, but at this point in time, the drafts that we've provided, we anticipate there will be no significant material changes to the final issued reports. One of the items as well, just for anyone that's new to the board, the village's audit must be finalized and issued as final prior to the library report being issued as final, since there are components that are reported on the village's audits. The IMRF allocation to the library is one of those components, since the library does have have a component of the IMRF allocation applied to its financial statements, so want to ensure that there's no changes to that component prior to the issuance of the library's report. So that's one of the reasons that we always wait for the village's report to be issued as final, so I just wanted to let everyone, make sure everyone is aware of that. So there's two documents that have been provided to you for review prior to tonight's meeting, and that's what I'll be going through you. First, the annual financial report for the fiscal year ended December 31st, 2024. And I'll be going through this in a bit of detail to help guide you through understanding what's reported in these financial statements and hopefully assist in your review and understanding of the report, kind of cover the key components of that. And then secondarily, the smaller of the two documents that we will be issuing once the reports are finalized is the board communication, which contains the required communication to those charged with governance that our auditing standards require us to communicate. Within the annual financial report, on page numbers 1 through 3, I'll just jump right in, is where you'll find the independent auditor's report, and we are prepared to issue a clean, unmodified opinion on the library's financial statements. That is the highest level of assurance that we can issue. That's based on the procedures that were conducted in accordance with generally accepted auditing standards. And I always, at this point in time, like to acknowledge, we couldn't issue this clean opinion without the assistance and organization and hard work that goes into not just preparing for the audit and providing all of the many requests that we have to complete our audit testing, but also the monthly and daily operational and procedural items that are completed by the library's team, the finance department, to ensure that things are maintained, organized, and tracked accurately. So I just always want to extend our team's appreciation. We do ask for a lot during the audit process. That's just what an audit entails, and Tracy goes above and beyond to ensure that we get our requests on a timely basis and can complete everything within the state mandated timeline. So it is. We just wanted to acknowledge that level of work is significant. This year, one of the paragraphs in the independent auditor's report notes a change in accounting principle. There was an implementation of a new GASB standard that did impact the library's financial statements for this fiscal year. And that was GASB Statement 101 in regards to compensated absences. So the change here is, in the past, compensated absences were those long-term liabilities associated with time that is accrued into future periods that can be paid out when an employee separates from the library. So you would consider this like your vacation time. Typically, that's what is eligible to be paid out at separation. Under the new GASB standard, any time that is accrued for time worked that can be used in future periods, regardless of if it's paid out in cash or used in another format. So sick time, which can be used in future periods, but it accrues for the current period, is under GASB 1 is now required to be considered a long-term liability. So that's the additional calculation and adjustment that was required for this fiscal period. So part of this analysis required an evaluation of course, we don't assume that 100% of all accrued sick days will be used in the future by employees. So there's some estimation required to kind of look back and see what the utilization is historically, and then apply it to the balances that are in place at year end. So that is reflected here as a comment about a change in accounting principle. This does not impact our auditor's opinion on the financial statements. You'll see that there was the change in accounting principle is presented as a restatement to the entity-wide financial statements, and there's a footnote disclosure regarding this change in accounting principle that was implemented. So this impacts the long-term liabilities that are presented on the entity-wide financial statements. It does not have any impact on the fund financial statements. So these are all considered long-term items, and they are not reported in the library's fund financial statements. So I do want to highlight that, as it's a pretty significant change for the fiscal year. Following the independent auditor's report, there's a section called the management's discussion and analysis. And if you read nothing else in the financial statements, I do encourage reading the MD&A. This is prepared by the library's finance team, and it is, it provides an executive summary of the financial statements, specifically the basic financial statements. So this runs from pages MD&A 1 through MD&A 6, and it provides a comparative current year and prior year actual for governmental activities. So you'll see some tables with current year audited balances as compared to prior year audited balances. That goes, that's not reflected in the financial statements themselves, as there's no comparative financials reported. But even beyond that comparative information, there's discussion and analysis that describes what caused some of the more significant changes and variances when comparing those balances, and provide some context to the numbers. So that graphical and table information, the side by side of the current year and prior year, as well as the discussion that's in there, does a really good job of summarizing and providing a good viewpoint of and perspective of what's reported in the financial statements themselves. So I do encourage reading through that MD&A section, if nothing else in the report. So following the MD&A in the basic financial statements, pages 4 and 5 are where you'll find what's called the statement of net position and the statement of activities. These two statements are presented on a full accrual basis of accounting, long-term viewpoint. So those long-term assets and long-term liabilities, the library are here, things that are not reflected in the fund financial statements. For instance, the library's net pension liability, the other post-employment benefit liability, the compensated absences liabilities, as I discussed in the implementation of GASB 101. So those accrued vacation and sick balances are reflected here as long-term liabilities, as they're not expected to be paid or extinguished within 1 year's time. So this is a very long-term, things that are being anticipated to be paid or extinguished and beyond 1 year. Also, your capital assets net of accumulated depreciation balances, those are reflected here, as those are long-term assets. Those are not maintained in your fund financial statements. So the balances here on the statement of activities and statement of net position are much larger because they are reflecting those more material long-term assets and liabilities. The net position of the library for the fiscal year ended December 31st, 2024, decreased 54,821 from the previous fiscal year. There was as I noted, the change in accounting principle related to GASB Statement 101 resulted in a restated net position, restatement of reduction of prior year's net position by 891,187. So when we implement a GASB's pronouncement, are not reflected as just a year-end change. We also restate the beginning because the implementation is reflected as of the January 1st, 2024 balance, and then the change for the fiscal year is reported in that regular increase or decrease in net position. So the current year activity only is reflected in the change in net position, while the restatement to bring on that beginning balance of the liability was measured at January 1st, 2024. That's what the restatement relates to. And then the category, the net position that's reflected on page 4 is broken out into 2 categories. There's net position for net investment in capital assets, and that is the 10,058,422. That's the balance of the library's capital assets net of accumulated depreciation, net of any related liabilities. So that's essentially the value of your net position that's tied up in your long-term assets. So that's not available to use for operations as it's not liquid. And then your unrestricted net position, that's the negative 12,420,269. That's the remainder of the net position that's associated with the assets plus deferred outflows minus liabilities and deferred inflows. So that's essentially your accounting equation. So that's the balance of the net position that's not tied up in the net investment in capital assets. Moving on beyond the statement of net position and statement of activities is where you'll find the balance sheet of the governmental funds. This, again, this is on page 6. And then on page 8, you'll find the governmental funds statement of expenditures and changes in fund balances. These two statements are reported on a modified accrual basis of accounting, so unlike those first two statements, these only incorporate assets and liabilities that are anticipated to be paid out within a year's time. So these are this is your short-term viewpoint. This is more in line with what you're used to reviewing on a monthly basis with the financial reports. You do have your accruals for accounts payable and short-term liabilities, but those long-term assets and liabilities are not maintained here. And these statements are broken out for the library's fund. So your general fund is the library's major fund. And the non-major fund column, that's the library's capital projects fund. So those are the two funds of the library. The activity is reported individually and then totals up to the total governmental funds balance here. Couple of key items to note here on the balance sheet and on the statement of revenue expenditures and changes in fund balances. As I noted, the general fund is the library's major fund. The library's unassigned fund balance in the library's general fund at December 31st, 2024 was $10,906,698. That is, the unassigned fund balance is what's available to fund subsequent year operations. So that's your fund balance that's not related to expendable items or restricted for any specific purposes or assigned. For instance, what's assigned for subsequent year's budget is the budgeted deficit for fiscal year 2025. So that's expected that the excess fund balance in the fund is to be used to fund what the library has budgeted as a deficit for 2025. So we, in the calculation, the unassigned fund balance excludes what's expected to be funding the subsequent year's deficit. And that's roughly 68% of the library's fiscal year 2024 expenditures. So over half of the year is available in the unassigned fund. So that fund balance has in 6 months of operational activity within it based on the 2024 activity. The statement of revenues, expenditures, and changes in fund balances on page 8. You'll note the general fund increased overall for the fiscal year ended December 31st, 2024 by 4.1 million, and that was after transfers out to the capital fund of 3,825,000. Revenues, however, were below expenditures, but the revenues were below expenditures by 346,949. So that was your deficit of the general fund balance outside of other financing sources and uses. Those transfers are transfers between funds. So they're moving fund balance from general fund to the capital projects fund, and a large the reason that transfer was so significant was to alleviate the deficit that was remaining in the pool of cash between the two funds. There was a deficit fund balance that carried in the capital projects fund at the end of prior fiscal year, so that was resolved with this transfer. The capital projects fund balance increased to 2.68 million, and that was with the addition of that transfer, the general fund this fiscal year. The footnotes begin on pages 10 and go through page 30. I'm not going to go into detail of these footnotes, but we'll just note that footnote 11 is that description of the change in accounting principles. So that's not a footnote that we would typically have, with the exception of when there are changes. So we have a description of that restatement was related to, and that was the entirety of the restatement related to the implementation of GASB 101 this fiscal year. Required supplementary information follows the footnotes, and that begins on page 31 and runs through page 35. Within the required supplementary information is a budget versus actual summarized schedule for the general fund. So that's on page 31 of the annual financial report. And you'll note that revenues were slightly below budgeted expectations for the general fund. Expenditures were below budget as well. The budgeted deficiency for the general fund for revenues, over expenditures was 871,000, whereas the actual deficiency was just that 346,949. And that's before taking into consideration the other financing sources and uses, so those, items that are moving transfers between funds. And following the general funds budget versus actual, schedule is the OPEB plan information. Currently, there are 7 years of information presented, and this information is going to build up to 10 years and present 10 years historical. Just
What
like
does OPEB mean?
OPEB is the other post-employment benefit
Okay.
plan, so that's because the library is an IMRF employer. Employees are mandated by state statutes to be allowed to be on the libraries and use the library's health insurance plan post-separation. So there's a calculation by actuaries prepared to take into consideration how that impacts the library's risk and the additional intrinsic liability of the retiree staying on plan and how that impacts the rates. So there's a actuarial calculation that's related to that, that's reflected on those, in those long-term liabilities on the statement of activities and statement of.
Is it just the employee or employee and family?
It is the employees were mandated to be allowed to stay on
Right.
post.
But not the family?
Feel about that.
Okay.
I believe it's the employees that are able to stay on post.
Yeah.
And that is a state requirement
Right.
for all IMRF employers. And I can confirm that with you as well. The IMRF plans information is presented on the following page, and there is 10 years of data available for IMRF now, so you now have that full 10-year historical view of IMRF for, the current year information for IMRF that is presented is actually IMRF's 2023 information, so the village and library do report IMRF a year, behind. And that's due to the IMRF plan having the same fiscal year end as the library and the village, so the audited final information of IMRF is not always available at the time that the library and village reports are issued, so they've chosen to report a year back to avoid any issues with issuing it if IMRF has a holdup of when their audited information. So the 2023 plan year, the library's of the IMRF plan, there was 94% funded, so it's a well-funded pension plan. And then the last two schedules of the report, the other information section, you'll find a detailed level budget versus actual schedule for the general fund on page 36. So it's similar to what was presented on page 31, but in much more line item detail. And then similar detailed budget versus actual schedule for the library's capital projects fund is found on page 37. Any questions on the annual financial report before I jump over to the board communication?
I have one other question, and that is. Look it down, and this might be for you, Mike, if someone retires. How much of the vacation time do they receive?
I think all of it, whatever's on the books.
Yeah,
Okay. But not if someone quits.
Oh, yeah.
no, I think it's a
Oh,
state law,
absolutely.
you have to
Yeah,
give it
state
30
law.
days, yeah.
So, wow, that's a lot.
Or if we
Earned,
fire them,
earned
Right.
we
unused.
fire them, we have to pay it out too.
Yeah, any
Okay.
separation.
Got it. All right.
The smaller of the two reports that I have, if there's no other questions on the draft annual financial report, is the auditor's communication to the members of the board of trustees. This is, what it contains within here is a memo on page 1 that just describes what the purpose of this report is, that the bulk of the information and the required communications begin on page 2. Our auditing standards do require that we report certain items to those charged with management. So, a lot of this is kind of a repeat of what's in the independent auditors report, but this goes a little bit more, beyond that as well. So first, in the second paragraph, once again, the communication regarding the change in accounting standards. So we do note that there was the implementation of GASB 101 here. This is called out a few times throughout both the annual financial report and here because it does have an impact on the reporting and it results in a change in how things are accounted for in your financial statements. So we just want to be sure that anyone reading the financial statements and the board reviewing these is understanding that there has been a change in accounting policies, procedures, and reporting due to that. We discussed certain accounting estimates that are reported in the financial statements. So I mentioned the IMRF and the other post-employment plan balances that are reflected in the library's financial statements. Those are based on valuations that are conducted by actuaries, and we are auditors. We are using the actuarial valuations. We consider those actuaries to be experts in their field. However, we are not actuaries, so we are relying on their assessments and their assumptions that are made to calculate those balances. So we just disclose that we consider those to be material and significant estimates that are reflected in those financial statements. The following page 3, the first paragraph, paragraph at the top, we disclosed that there were no difficulties with management throughout the performing and completion of the audit. Had there been any, this would not be the first time that we would discuss those with you, but we just, as required by auditing standards, we are required to disclose that. There were no such items that came up throughout the audit process. Corrected and uncorrected misstatements. Here we disclose that there are certain items that we consider to be uncorrected misstatements. So there were certain items that throughout the auditing process and year after year that were determined to be not significantly material to the financial statements. However, significant enough to report to the board that they are not reflected in those audited balances. So they're carried on what we call a past adjustment schedule. And that's one of the schedules that's included in this board communication. So what that means is that those uncorrected misstatements are not material enough that we determined they don't need to be made as adjustments and reported in the financial statements directly, but we do let you know what their impact would be had they been adjusted to the prior balances. And then material corrected misstatements are those that we consider audit adjustments, and there is also a listing of audit adjustments contained within this document as well. Finally, disagreements with management on that same page. Once again, there were no agreements about the audit process that arose as part of our auditing procedures. Otherwise, those would be disclosed here and would have been previously discussed. The last page just describes some other matters regarding what our audit opinion covers and the additional schedules that are included within the basic, that are beyond the basic financial statements, the required supplementary information and other information. And the restriction of use, this, just to note that this information is for those charged with governance. So this is to be used by the library's management and board. Beginning on page number 5 is where you'll find a listing of audit adjustments. So we call those AJEs, or audit adjusting journal entries. The material entries, AJE 1, related to certain items that were just reported directly to fund balance. As part of the audit process, we wanted those adjustments to be reflected on the income statement running through the P&L rather than reported directly to fund balance when they were made. So that was an adjustment to reflect those changes on the income statement rather than directly to fund balance. They will close to fund balance at the close of the fiscal year end, but we just made the adjustment to run it through the current year activity before that occurs. AJE 3 and AJE 4, those are pretty lengthy entries, but those relate to that implementation of GASB 101. So those were all the accounts that needed to be that were impacted to reflect that implementation of GASB 101 calculations. I think those are the largest of the entries that are listed here.
All the ones that say principal payment.
And the, past adjustments, so that is what is reflected on page 9, so. What is listed as a past adjustment of 3 years ago now, there was an implementation of GASB 87 regarding how leases are reported in the financial statements, and when. We were reviewing the calculations for those, it was determined that the leases the library has were not significantly material, so that was not implemented as a, as a standard in the financial statements directly, so that calculation is maintained and we'll review it each year and report it on the past adjustments. And the management letter is the final piece within this board communication, that begins on page 11 and, kind of runs through the end of the report. If there had been any material weaknesses or significant deficiencies that came up throughout the audit process, these would be communicated here. Pleased to note that there were no such items, so material weaknesses or significant deficiencies, they are described here in this letter. Those would be anything that arose that made us concerned that there's a lack of procedures in place that could result in a misstatement to the financial statement. So based on the testing that we performed and the review of the internal control processes that are in place, there were no items that came up that gave us any concern that there are material weaknesses or significant deficiencies. There were also no other comments beyond letting you know what future year GASB pronouncements that may impact the financial statements in subsequent years. So that's essentially what's listed here. It's quite a long list of GASB pronouncements, and we do review those each year as part of our audit planning process and throughout the audit process to ensure the library's well aware and has anything in place that will be required to implement those pronouncements. Any questions on the board communication?
So just for the future accounting pronouncements,
Mhm.
are those gonna be challenging, you know, to pull that information or? If it's all there.
What I would say is that Zinkish is a great partner in terms of, we have a planning meeting before every, year end. And they'll flag things for coming, not just effective for the next fiscal year, but even down the road. And we have good discussions about, you know, the best way for us to kind of take a stab, they'll do the calculations and kind of on their input. And if we're on the right track and things like that. So, so far we've not, you know, even if there's uncompensated absence, those are entirely new calculations, we receive really good guidance from Sylvia on how to hold it, that's what I know in terms of.
Good.
And I'll add to that, the past 3 years, there's been some pretty significant material adjustments that required a lot of additional work. What's coming down the pipeline, there is one statement in a couple of years that's effective that will require some changes to the management discussion and analysis. So we provide training and we offer guidance regarding that. We've started to, although it's not effective for a couple fiscal years away, but as far as kind of what's coming down the GASB pipeline and why we want to make, as soon as it becomes available, we publish that and make the board aware, the library aware. So that preparation is there, and we do offer a lot of trainings internally to our clients to assist with those implementations. But the past 3 years, there has been some pretty significant and challenging ones that have required a lot of additional time and effort by the library. So once again, just appreciate the preparedness and the professionalism that's provided to us.
Wonderful, thank you. And thank you to the finance department.
Thank you.
We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Moving on to other. Here's another. You're going.
I went to the trustee banquet past Friday in Oak Park, and it was very nice. I was at a table with Rolling Meadows and Prospect Heights. Someone knew you with you from Rolling Meadows, some woman, okay, she knew you. So they were at the table, and the keynote presentation was a panel discussion with authors, Rebecca Mackay. I don't know if anyone ever read
Yeah,
The Great Believers.
I just read her new book.
Yeah, I just grabbed them from the library
Yeah.
earlier when I got here. So her and Juan Martinez, who writes kind of like horror like satire horde, which isn't really one of those. So I didn't read the books, but now I'm going to, and they were checked out of it at the library, so it must be good. But no, it was very interesting and it was a good time. I met a lot of people and I would hope to get a bigger contingency next year. Cause I did have a few people ask, you're the only one from Northern Heights. So everybody's just got all kinds of things on vacation. and- Yes, graduations, that was a huge thing. So I hope people will go next year. That's very nice.
Thank you. All right. Well, with that said, I will entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second all in favor? Aye. 1 hour.